Most humans cannot drink milk. This is not a disease, not a deficiency, and not a problem that needs to be fixed. It is the default biological state of every mammal on Earth, including humans. After weaning, the body stops producing the enzyme lactase, which breaks down lactose, the primary sugar in milk. The gut stops making lactase because, under normal evolutionary conditions, there is no reason to continue making it. The animal has been weaned. It will not encounter milk again. The ability to digest fresh milk as an adult, lactase persistence, is a genetic mutation. It appeared in a small population of herders in what is now Central Europe roughly 7,500 years ago. It spread because it conferred a survival advantage in certain environments and in certain historical conditions. Today, it is common in populations of Northern European descent, present in some 90% of Scandinavians and about 70% of British and Irish people. It is present in only about 15 to 25% of people of East Asian descent, and in variable but generally lower frequencies across sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. The global average across all populations is approximately 35%. Most people on Earth are lactose intolerant by the standards of a dietary system built around Northern European biology. This is the central paradox of the global dairy industry. We have built a $900 billion annual market, required milk in school lunch programs across dozens of countries, and made it a cornerstone of dietary guidelines from Washington to Beijing. The majority of the people those policies apply to cannot properly digest it. Understanding how that happened requires going back not to the mutation itself, but to what herders were doing with milk before most of them could drink it. The oldest archaeological evidence of dairy production comes from sites in what is now Turkey and the Fertile Crescent, dating to some 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. This is significant because it predates the widespread spread of lactase persistence by at least 1,000 years. The people who first domesticated cattle, goats, and sheep and began milking them were, in all likelihood, largely lactose intolerant. They could not drink fresh milk in significant quantities without gastrointestinal consequences. But they could eat cheese. Fermentation dramatically reduces the lactose content of milk. When bacteria culture in fresh milk to produce yogurt, or when cheese is made and aged, the bacteria consume the lactose as their food source. A well-aged hard cheese contains almost no lactose. Fresh yogurt contains substantially less than fresh milk. Butter contains only traces. The early history of dairying is not a history of milk drinking. It is a history of fermentation and processing, of people finding ways to extract the nutritional value of a food they could not consume in its raw form. This is consistent with the broader pattern of early food technology. Fermentation was a solution to the problem of perishability and digestibility, applied to dairy just as it was applied to grain. The residues of early dairy processing have been found on ancient pottery across the Near East and Europe, confirmed by the chemical signatures of milk fats preserved in the clay. These ceramics tell a specific story. People were heating and straining milk, producing something like a primitive cheese or yogurt at sites going back to the earliest farming communities. They were dairying before they could dairy. The genetic capacity to drink fresh milk as an adult came later and spread through populations already embedded in dairy-producing cultures, which is part of what made the mutation so advantageous when it appeared. The spread of lactase persistence through European populations was not simply a matter of a mutation arising and propagating neutrally. It was driven by selection pressure specific to the cultural and environmental context of Neolithic herding societies. Populations that kept cattle, goats, and sheep had access to a food source, milk, that, if digestible, provided calories, protein, fat, calcium, and hydration in a portable, renewable form. In environments where crop failures were common, milk from a living animal represented a food supply that could survive a drought that destroyed the grain harvest. The herder who could drink fresh milk had access to calories that the herder who could not was losing to fermentation or discarding. The advantage compounded across generations into one of the strongest signatures of positive natural selection in the human genome. Lactase persistence, once it arose, gave its carriers a meaningful nutritional edge. Fresh milk is calorically dense, protein-rich, and provides calcium and vitamin D in a form directly absorbable by the body. In northern latitudes, where sunlight is insufficient for adequate vitamin D synthesis through skin for much of the year, the ability to absorb calcium and vitamin D from milk had real survival consequences. In famines, when grain crops failed, the ability to draw nutrition directly from milk without the calorie loss of cheese production could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The mutation spread through a combination of these advantages, combined with the cultural infrastructure, the cattle herds, the processing knowledge, the trade networks that dairy-producing societies had already built. By the time European colonial powers were projecting authority across the rest of the world in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the association between dairy consumption and Northern European populations had calcified into something more loaded. A belief that dairy was natural, essential, and civilizing, and that populations that did not drink milk were nutritionally deficient or culturally backward. British colonial nutrition science in India and Africa observed that local populations drank little fresh milk and concluded, from a baseline that assumed Northern European physiology, that this was a dietary deficiency to be corrected. The possibility that these populations had evolved in dairy-sparse environments and had not developed lactase persistence for entirely rational biological reasons was not seriously considered. The most direct expression of dairy's colonial logic appeared in China in the early 2000s. The Chinese government, concerned about childhood nutrition and influenced by Western dietary models, launched a sustained campaign to increase dairy consumption in a population where lactose intolerance rates exceed 90% in many regions. State media promoted milk as essential for children's growth and intelligence. School programs distributed dairy products. Chinese dairy production was expanded substantially to meet the anticipated demand, and international dairy companies, including Nestle and Danone, invested heavily in the market. The campaign produced increased dairy consumption among some populations and digestive distress in many others. The market structure it created was also vulnerable to contamination scandals, most notably the 2008 melamine scandal, in which infant formula was adulterated with an industrial chemical to artificially boost its protein readings. At least 6 infants died, and hundreds of thousands were hospitalized. This colonial dairy logic had long-term consequences. When the United States developed its first dietary guidelines in the early 20th century, the scientific consensus on which they were built had come primarily from researchers studying populations with high rates of lactase persistence. The same was true when international nutritional standards were codified by the FAO and WHO after World War II. The recommendation to consume multiple servings of dairy per day was not a universal nutritional recommendation. It was a recommendation that made biological sense for a specific subset of humanity, generalized to everyone. The U.S. school lunch program, established in 1946, has required milk to be offered at every meal since its inception. A student who wishes to decline milk must, in many school districts, bring a doctor's note. The program purchases and distributes hundreds of millions of gallons of milk annually, creating a captive market that has supported the American dairy industry for decades. Advocacy groups representing Asian American, Black, and Latino communities have repeatedly pointed out that the children most likely to be lactose intolerant are the children least represented in the research that established milk as a nutritional requirement. The program has not changed in any fundamental way. In the cities of the late 19th century, fresh milk was one of the most dangerous foods available. Urban dairies operated in conditions that produced milk contaminated with bovine tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. The distribution chain, from dairy farm to urban consumer, was long enough that milk delivered on a summer morning could be lethally spoiled by afternoon. Infant mortality in American cities in the 1890s and 1900s was substantially driven by contaminated milk, with estimates suggesting tens of thousands of infant deaths per year attributable to milk-borne disease in New York City alone. The problem was understood, the solution was known, the implementation took decades. Pasteurization, heating milk to a temperature sufficient to kill pathogenic bacteria without fully cooking the product, had been demonstrated effective in France in the 1860s and was commercially viable by the 1880s. The resistance to its adoption came primarily from the dairy industry itself. Pasteurization shortened the shelf life of milk by killing the bacteria that would otherwise signal spoilage more obviously. It also required equipment and added a step to the production process. More importantly, pasteurized milk from one source was indistinguishable from pasteurized milk from another, reducing the premium that clean, well-managed dairies could charge for their product. The clean dairy operators, paradoxically, had the most to lose from mandatory pasteurization of a market they were currently winning. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the driving force behind the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, spent years fighting for mandatory pasteurization. He faced a coalition of dairy interests, libertarian food purists who believed pasteurization was an adulteration of a natural product, and rural producers who feared the cost of compliance. The New York City Pasteurization Ordinance of 1912 required all milk sold in the city to be pasteurized. It was achieved after a decade of political struggle, following a public campaign that made contaminated milk a middle-class political issue by publishing infant mortality statistics neighborhood by neighborhood. Mandatory pasteurization became national standard by the 1920s and 1930s. The raw milk that killed tens of thousands of children became a prohibited product, and the debate retreated from public health into a niche of food politics that has never fully gone away. The raw milk movement of the 21st century frames pasteurization as industrial suppression of a natural food, and positions raw milk as a health food with probiotic advantages over pasteurized product. It recapitulates the early 20th century debate with different vocabulary. The public health case for pasteurization is well established, and the pathogens that contaminated 19th century milk have not gone away. The political case made by raw milk advocates, that individuals should have the right to choose their food without government mediation, is identical to the case the dairy industry made in 1900. The framing has shifted from commercial interest to personal freedom. The argument has not changed. The debate reveals how quickly the memory of why a regulation existed can be lost once the problem it solved becomes invisible. In the 1950s, a physiologist named Ancel Keys began publishing research arguing that saturated fat in the diet caused elevated blood cholesterol, which caused heart disease. Keys was a driven and combative scientist who believed the relationship was clear and the public health implications urgent. His 7-country study, launched in 1958 and published in various forms over the following decades, tracked the relationship between dietary fat consumption and heart disease rates across Japan, Italy, Greece, Finland, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and the United States. The study found a strong correlation between saturated fat consumption and heart disease mortality. The methodological problem with the 7-country study was that Keys had data from 22 countries and chose 7 of them. The countries he did not include, among them France, Switzerland, and West Germany, which had high fat consumption and low heart disease rates, did not fit the pattern he was describing. This was not secret information. Critics raised it at the time, and Keyes responded with aggressive dismissal rather than engagement. The scientific community did not reach consensus on Keyes's hypothesis for decades. The political and industrial community moved considerably faster. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation, funded by the sugar industry, paid 3 Harvard scientists the equivalent of $50,000 in today's terms to publish a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine. The article reviewed the existing evidence on diet and heart disease and concluded that fat and cholesterol were the primary dietary causes, while minimizing the evidence implicating sugar. The scientists involved did not disclose their industry funding, as was standard practice at the time. The article was influential. The funding connection was not publicly revealed until 2016, when researchers found the documents in a university archive. The McGovern Committee's 1977 dietary guidelines emerged from a political process as much as a scientific one. The committee was under pressure from agricultural interests, particularly the meat and dairy industries, which had initially fought the low-fat recommendations. The beef industry lobbied successfully to change the original language. The phrase, "eat less meat," became, "choose meats, poultry, and fish that will reduce saturated fat intake," a formulation implying the problem was specific types of meat rather than meat consumption itself. The dairy industry similarly shaped the language around dairy to preserve consumption recommendations while allowing for low-fat product promotion. The document that emerged was a compromise between public health goals and the commercial interests of the industries whose products it was evaluating. This is not unique to the 1977 guidelines. It describes the process by which most food policy is made. The 1977 McGovern Committee Dietary Guidelines, issued by the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, codified the low-fat doctrine into official U.S. policy. Americans should reduce their fat intake, particularly saturated fat, and increase carbohydrate consumption. The dairy industry initially fought these recommendations, which threatened consumption of whole milk and cheese. It eventually adapted, shifting its marketing and product development toward low-fat and fat-free products. The consequence for the American diet was that fat was replaced with sugar and refined carbohydrates in processed foods, reformulated to meet the low-fat standard. Per capita sugar consumption rose sharply through the 1980s and 1990s. The obesity epidemic, measured by body mass index, began accelerating in exactly the same period. The relationship is not simple or direct, but the coincidence is not trivial either. The Holstein cow that produces most of the milk in the United States and much of the world is a product of selective breeding that has produced an animal almost unrecognizable from its ancestors. A wild aurochs, the ancestor of modern cattle, produced enough milk to feed a single calf. A modern Holstein in an industrial dairy operation produces roughly 10 times what a cow produced a century ago, up to 12,000 liters per year. This was achieved through selective breeding for production traits and management practices that optimize the cow's body for milk output. The trade-off is a shortened productive life and a range of health problems requiring continuous veterinary management. A cow produces milk only in response to pregnancy and birth. Industrial dairy operations maintain cows in continuous or near-continuous pregnancy cycles, typically through artificial insemination, to sustain milk production. Male calves born in this process have no value in a dairy operation and are typically sold to the beef industry or veal industry within days of birth. Female calves are raised to replace their mothers in the milking rotation. The cycle continues until the cow's production declines, usually after 3 or 4 lactation cycles, a small fraction of a cow's natural lifespan of 20 or more years. The animals that produce the most milk have the shortest productive lives because the metabolic demands of extreme milk production cannot be sustained indefinitely. The use of recombinant bovine somatotropin, RBST, a synthetic growth hormone, to increase milk production, was approved by the FDA in 1993 over the objections of consumer groups and some scientists who argued the approval was premature. The European Union, Canada, Japan, and Australia have all declined to approve RBST, citing animal welfare concerns and precautionary public health reasoning. American dairy operations using RBST are required to label their products accordingly, which has created a de facto marketing distinction in which RBST-free has become a premium selling point rather than the baseline. The distinction tells consumers something about how the milk was produced. It tells them less about what else was involved. Antibiotics are used in dairy operations to treat the mastitis, udder infection, that is endemic in high-production herds, and prophylactically in some operations to prevent it. The United States uses more antibiotics per unit of animal product than most other developed nations, and the vast majority of those antibiotics are used in food animal production. The connection between antibiotic use in livestock and the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in humans is well established in principle. The epidemiology of specific transmission routes remains contested in its details. The regulatory response in the US has been slower than in the EU, where certain antibiotic uses in food animal production have been restricted or banned. The gap between what is permitted and what is practiced varies by country, by antibiotic class, and by the enforcement capacity of the relevant regulatory authority. The economics of American dairy farming have been in crisis for most of the 21st century. The number of dairy farms in the United States has declined from some 650,000 in 1970 to fewer than 28,000 today. The farms that remain are larger, more mechanized, and more heavily indebted than their predecessors. Milk prices are set through a federal pricing system that was designed in the 1930s to stabilize farm incomes and has not been substantially reformed since. The system has consistently produced milk surpluses, which the government has purchased and converted into cheese, butter, and powdered milk stored in government warehouses. The government cheese program, which distributed surplus dairy products to low-income Americans from the 1980s onward, fed millions of people, while also being a mechanism for removing price-depressing surpluses from the market. The dairy industry receives more federal subsidy support per dollar of production than almost any other agricultural sector. The $2 gallon of milk at the supermarket does not reflect its full cost.
The global market for plant-based milk alternatives reached around $18 billion in 2023 and is projected to continue growing toward $40 billion by 2030. Oat milk is the fastest-growing category. Oatly, the Swedish oat milk company, went public in 2021 at a valuation of $10 billion. That figure reflects not just the current market, but the expectation of a fundamental shift in how a large portion of the world gets its dairy-like products. The shift is real. Whether it solves the problems of industrial dairy or creates new ones depends on which problem you are trying to solve. Oat milk's environmental case is strong relative to cow's milk on most metrics. Lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower water use, lower land use per liter of product. Soy milk is similarly favorable on environmental grounds and has a protein content closer to cow's milk than most alternatives. Almond milk dominated American supermarkets through the 2010s and has a more complicated profile than its marketing suggests. It requires less land and produces fewer emissions than dairy, but it requires substantial water. About 80% of the world's almonds are grown in California, a state experiencing chronic drought. One almond requires about 1 gallon of water to produce. Almond milk's environmental advantage over dairy is real on some dimensions and overstated on others. The dairy industry has fought the labeling of plant-based alternatives as milk with sustained political effort. Its argument? The FDA's standard of identity for milk requires it to come from a lactating animal, and the label should be enforced to prevent consumer confusion. The plant-based industry has argued that consumers understand what they are buying, and that the milk label is broadly understood to mean a white liquid used in contexts similar to dairy milk.
Restricting the label, it contends, would disadvantage smaller producers who lack the resources to navigate complex alternative naming. The FDA issued draft guidance in 2023, suggesting it would allow the milk label for plant-based alternatives while requiring nutritional disclosure. The final rule has not been issued. The legal and political battle continues. What plant-based milk is, nutritionally, depends heavily on what has been added to it. Oat milk in its basic form is water, oats, and oil. The protein content is low. The micronutrient profile is nothing like cow's milk. The versions sold in supermarkets are typically fortified with calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12, and other nutrients to approximate the nutritional profile of the dairy product they are replacing. This makes plant-based milks nutritionally functional as substitutes. But the person drinking oat milk for its natural qualities is drinking a product engineered to approximate the nutritional profile of the product it replaces. The fortification techniques used are the same ones that make enriched white bread nutritionally comparable to whole grain bread. The irony is structural, not accidental. The global dairy industry and the plant-based alternatives that are challenging it share a common feature. Both are largely invisible to the people consuming them. The cow that produced the milk in the carton, the oat that went into the barista blend, the regulatory decisions that determined what additives were permitted. None of this is visible at the point of purchase. The product is a white liquid in a container. What it took to get there is a story that most people who buy it will never encounter. The lactase persistence mutation that made dairy consumption biologically comfortable for a minority of humans has been treated for most of the last century as a universal human baseline. The dietary guidelines built on that baseline have been applied globally through school lunch programs, international aid nutrition standards, and public health recommendations that assumed a physiology specific to one ethnic and geographic group. The harm this has done is diffuse and hard to measure. Generations of children in schools where declining the milk carton required a doctor's note. Populations in countries where dairy was promoted as the solution to malnutrition, despite high rates of lactose intolerance in those populations. The assumption was not neutral. It was a particular biology, wearing the costume of universal science. The fat wars of the 1950s through 1980s produced dietary guidelines that millions of people followed. Industry-funded science had redirected public health policy toward low-fat recommendations and away from sugar restriction. Those guidelines may have contributed to the obesity epidemic they were designed to prevent. The reckoning with that history, the 2016 revelations about Harvard and the Sugar Research Foundation, the subsequent re-examination of Keyes's methodology, the gradual shift in dietary consensus away from the low-fat doctrine, took 50 years. The people who made decisions based on the science as it was presented to them at the time had no way to know what was in the funding acknowledgments that weren't being disclosed. Milk arrived in human culture as an accident of fermentation and a byproduct of the domestication of cattle for other purposes. It became a dietary staple for populations that developed the genetic capacity to consume it. It became a global industry through a combination of colonial nutritional assumptions, wartime food policy, industry lobbying, and the genuine nutritional case that can be made for a product that is calorically dense, protein-rich, and calcium-bearing. It is now being challenged by a generation of plant-based alternatives that carry their own environmental trade-offs and their own fortification compromises. What it has never been across all of this is the simple, natural, universal human food that the marketing says it is. That story was always more complicated than the picture on the carton.